Hello and welcome wherever you are in the world, particularly if you're in Alice Springs, Tennant Creek, Mount Isa. Any of those names ring a bell? Those symbolic places of the great Australian outback where I, the humble Humphrey Hawksley, who is your host for the next hour, I cut my teeth there as a young man in the mines and the sheep and cattle farms and hitchhiking on the road trains and the trucks there. And that's where we're going to go today in memory of a legendary author who would have turned 100 this year. Desmond Bagley's adventure stories captured the imaginations of millions as I was growing up, alongside others like Alistair MacLean, Hammond Innes, Len Dayton. And then, of course, Frederick Forsyth and John le Carre came up behind as the new kids on the block. And my guest today is an even newer kid, and he is bravely writing a sequel to a Desmond Bagley posthumously published thriller. That was called Domino Island. The new one is Outback. But this is a Goldster conversation. So it's about far more than adventure thrillers. A peek at my guest's website has sections on his music, his performing, his writing of a musical. And I'm going to ask him this question. I can ask you this question too. What do Thomas Hardy and the rugged Australian outback have in common? No answer yet, because welcome, Michael Davies to Goldster Inside Story.
Thank you very much, Humphrey. I don't think I've been called a new kid for a very long time.
Well, I think you're the new kid on the block. You're certainly the new kid on the block for our Goldster conversation. Now, I'm just sort of fascinated by this ridiculous question. And one of the rules of Goldster, incidentally, is that the only stupid question is the one you never ask. So what do Thomas Hardy and Desmond Bagley and the Australian outback have in common?
Well, I'm just conjuring up images, actually, of Thomas Hardy in the Australian outback. I think that would have been fascinating, wouldn't it? Well, I suppose the simple answer to the question is me, actually, because I've worked on works by both of them. The Hardy that you're referencing is the musical. I've co-written a musical version of Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which is imaginatively titled Tess the Musical. I wrote the book and lyrics for it with the composer Michael Blore, and that's in development at the moment. Whereas the Bagley, I mean, I as you quite right say, was lucky enough to get to work on Domino Island, which was a manuscript found in his archives 36 years after he died. Something like that. And,
so I'd like to sort of draw us back a bit, and I want you to give me a pen picture of who Thomas Hardy was, followed by a pen picture of who Desmond Bagley was.
Gosh, talk about putting me on the spot. Okay, well, Hardy, I mean, primarily thought of himself as a poet, actually. So from the late Victorian era through into the 20th century, it's a large body of sort of bucolic, quasi-romantic, I suppose, poetry. But he also wrote these vast doorstep novels, which, you know, I'm sure lots of people will be very familiar with. They've been on school English curricula for
decades. The canon of English literature, aren't they? Yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And in fact, that's where I first came across Tess. I studied it for A-level. Tess is an interesting one. It's one of those books that Hardy's novels can be quite heavy going, quite grim, quite dark. But you talk to lots of people, and Tess of the D'Urbervilles keeps on coming up as, you know, on those lists of people's top 10 favorite novels. And I think there's just something about it, something about the way that he characterizes the people, the villages in that kind of situation. But also, I think Hardy's particularly strong on landscape and locating people in.
Well, I was going to talk, because in these two contrasting things that we're talking about, and I'm not quite sure how we got there, but we're going to stick with it. You have powerful locations, don't you? You have you go to, is it West Country? You go. They say this is Hardy country. Yeah. You know, this is where Tess had all her dramas. And then in this case, you got the Australian outback. I immediately think of Neville Shute and a town like Alice, and then then the other ones. So I just wanted, before we even get to that, about yourself. How come you ended up as following the footsteps of a great thriller writer and also doing musicals and whatever? And before I ask you that, I think Michelle Whitworth has come in and helped you a bit here. Bagley used to be a favorite thriller writer of mine, excited when I came across Domino Island, so excited by this development. So Michael, don't let Michelle down, for goodness sake.
No pressure. Well, I'm in absolute agreement with Michelle. Bagley is definitely a favourite of mine. I first came across him. I've got two older brothers, and they introduced me to him when I was a teenager, in fact. And I kind of lapped up everything that he produced. He got into a pattern in his career, which I'm aiming towards. He would write for 3 months or so and produce a book in that time, and the rest of the year he and his wife Joan would go touring the world and go and research the next location for the following book, which I think is a great way of running a career. And yeah, so back to your question.
So but he how did he get into thriller writing? Was he a special forces ex-commando, or how did he do that?
Well, his story is rather extraordinary, actually, and would make a good book in itself. He was born in Kendal, brought up in Blackpool, and he had quite a bad speech impediment, so he didn't get called up in the Second World War. But he worked in a munitions factory in Blackpool. And then 2 or 3 years after the end of the war, he answered an advert in the local paper for a group of people who were planning to trek overland from the UK to South Africa. And he joined this group. I think there were about 25 of them. And they set off on this kind of random journey to South Africa. It took him quite a while to get there because he actually broke away from the group of people that he was traveling with. And it ended up staying quite a while in Kenya and 1 or 2 other places on his way. When he got to South Africa, I mean, he tried his hand at lots of different things. He was involved in mining. He did some radio journalism. He did film reviews for a magazine. But I think writing had always been there at the back of his mind. And when he and his wife, who he met in Johannesburg, Joan, came back to the UK at the beginning of the 60s, that's when he really started. So, I mean, by that point, he was almost 40. So he was quite a late starter with the novels. And the first one, The Golden Keel, came out in 1963, and he kind of never looked back.
Okay, so 63, he was the thriller writer's Summer of Love with the Beatles and She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, and he was part of the Swinging Sixes. You mentioned about his modus operandi of 3 months writing and then traveling the world looking for new locations. And the 2 books you've been involved in, or you've written, is Domino Island, which was discovered in the attic or something 6 years after he died, and Outback, which has just come out. So did you go to the Domino Islands, the Caribbean, isn't it? So did you follow in his footsteps or his vision of life?
Sadly not with that one, no. It was a complete manuscript. It was a typescript. It was discovered in about 2017, so yeah, well over 30 years after he died. In his archive, which had by that point been shipped to a museum in Boston, America. And everybody was terribly excited when it got discovered. Joan, after Bagley died in 83, Joan had completed a couple of others of his. So it wasn't completely unprecedented for posthumous novels, but she'd stopped after 2. I think she felt that
Joan is his widow. Is that
that's right?
Widow.
That's
yeah.
right. And one of them had got, I think, a rather sniffy review in one of the national papers. And she said at that point, right, okay, well, I'm not going to do any more then.
Yeah.
But she herself died in 1999. I mean, that's a sort of another story. I had been briefly in contact with her before she died. So that's how I was alerted originally to the existence of the archive in Boston. And then when this manuscript was discovered, the publishers, who, to their enormous credit, have kept Bagley in print continuously since the 80s. And David Braun has been a guest of yours, Humphrey, had approached me when this manuscript was found and said, would I like to have a read of it? Of course, you know, as a Bagley fan from my youth, I bit his hand off. And then, you know, one thing led to another, and eventually he got to a point where, at the time, the rights were still owned by the trustees of the Bagley estate. They've actually now since been bought by HarperCollins.
So how would you, because the manuscript was decades old, essentially, but was found 6 years ago or so in the thing. When you went through that, how much were you thinking that you needed to change in order to meet today's market demands, and also this other thing about censoring, you know, that you can't say certain things because, you know, today's world isn't going to accept it?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. And that was one of the things that we kind of grappled with a little bit. There was a moment when we considered setting it in the present day, transposing it to the modern era, but for various reasons, among them the fact that we wanted to stay true to Bagley's legacy, but also there's something about not having access to modern technology, mobile phones, for instance, that was very appealing. And I think one of the things Bagley is brilliant at is using the available technology of the time.
So you were dealing with 60s technology, weren't you?
72, he actually wrote the manuscript.
72, okay.
Yeah, and there was a bizarre story around that because he wrote it. It starts at the beginning and it finishes with the end in the original manuscript. So it was complete, but it was definitely a first draft. And he said as much. I mean, there were lots of annotations and there was correspondence between him and his then editor about what he would do if he were going to go and do a second draft. And then for reasons that we don't know, he withdrew it and never went back to it. He put it in a bottom drawer and seemingly forgot about it. So that work was never done, but it did give me a really good steer on the way he would have gone with it had he gone back.
Give us an idea, Michael. We talk about 1963, that era, because the ones, and I mentioned in the intro that, you know, Desmond Bagley, of course, was there when I was a child. Alistair MacLean was there. Len Dayton was there. Those Hammond Innes was there. So what is the, you know, who were the readers in those days, and are they the same now? Because, you know, the market goes for different things, doesn't it?
It does, and that's another really interesting question, and touches on your point a moment ago about the work that needed doing to kind of make it not palatable. It wasn't. It was unpalatable, but appropriate, I guess, more appropriate for a modern audience. And you know, if you read Bagley's books now, they're still fantastically gripping and brilliant examples of the genre, and for reasons I can't really explain, they seem to have fallen out of fashion in a way that, for instance, MacLean hasn't so much. Maybe MacLean is more to do with the fact that there were lots of films made of his books, and you know, big profile films too.
And the Second World War, was Bagley's Second World War? I mean, Second War always stays in fashion in a way, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. And MacLean did definitely set a lot of his books in the Second World War, which Bagley didn't do so much. His were much more contemporary from when he was.
Yes, and I remember John le Carré, the late John le Carré, saying how he lost his direction after the Cold War ended, because that clarity of the good guy and the bad guy sort of vanishes, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a yeah, I mean, you know, it's cowboys, isn't it? The black hat and the white hat, and who's the goodie, who's the baddie, and of course the war sets a very easy kind of backdrop, but for those those kind of juxtapositions.
Yeah.
Um,
In those days, I've just named, you can count them on one hand, the sort of prominent people, but now there are so many books published and so many people involved in it, and the movies become the books and the series and TikTok and everything like that, all over the place. Is it very different, or are there now of that genre sort of 5 household names that we know that are writing at the moment?
I'm not sure that genre quite exists in the way that it did then. Yeah, of course there are spy novels, there are thrillers, there's cozy crime, there's noir, there's Scandi noir, all sorts of subdivisions. That kind of adventure thriller, I think, is probably the best way I can describe it.
Yes.
I'm struggling to think of many people. Wilbur Smith, I suppose.
The late Wilbur Smith, because he was at his peak 30 years ago, wasn't he? Can I put this out to our audience? Michelle, I think, has kicked off that thought. If any of you got any thoughts of what you like to read, whether you like the adventure novel, whether there are enough around, too many around, or whatever, just put it in the chat. Anything you want to ask Michael to, put it in the chat and we'll tackle it. What I'd like to do is give me 10 seconds top line each on Domino Island and Outback, and then I want to go a little bit further into how you constructed those books.
Okay, Domino Island, as you say, set in the Caribbean. It's a fictional Caribbean island. Bill Kemp, the hero, it's first person, so he narrates it, is an insurance fraud investigator, and he is alerted to a potential case of insurance fraud after the death of a high-profile politician on this Caribbean island. Flies out to investigate, and various complications and nefarious goings-on ensue. And when that was published, HarperCollins were very happy with it, and they were looking for a way of celebrating the centenary, which is 2023. And at that point, I said to them, I think there might be more mileage in Bill Kemp as a character. I mean, I felt I knew him pretty well by that point. How about an original sequel, but using the same character? And fortunately, they said, yes, thank you very much, that'll do nicely. So that's how Outback came about. Outback puts him investigating a case while he's actually on his Christmas holidays in Australia, visiting an old friend, who turns up a probate case involving an abandoned opal mine in the middle of the Australian outback. It appears to be worthless, but once death threats start happening against the young lady and her husband who have inherited the mine, then the investigation involves them going out into the middle of the desert.
And did you go trekking across the desert in camels and going down mines as part of your research?
I'd love to be able to say yes, but unfortunately not. I have been to Australia, but I haven't been to the locations. And in Outback, the locations are genuine locations. They're real places.
So, because this is interesting. So, how do you because that first scene that you've got in there of the trapped down in the mine and everything like that, how do you conjure up such a graphic and vivid opening scene without having been trapped in an outback mine in Australia yourself?
Some of it's research, inevitably. There's a lot of research goes into it. And some of it also probably inevitably is imagination. And I was saying earlier that Bagley is particularly good on research and factual information. And I was keen that it should be as factually accurate as possible to try and follow that pattern. But there does come a point, I think, probably for every writer, where a bit of dramatic license comes into play, and I don't think you need to have fallen down a mine shaft to be able to imagine what that might feel like. I don't think you have to have been in a mine to get a sense of how claustrophobic it might feel. I suppose it's a bit like, well, do you have to have murdered someone to know,
to know,
put yourself in the mind of a murderer?
I mean, there's a couple of points that come off that in the sort of writing conversation. We have a lot of these on Goldster, so people are interested in this. They say that in a thriller you have to be absolutely accurate as to how the gun works and how. But if you get something wrong, or you might, in the type of sand that's in the desert, or the weight that a mine shaft can bear, or whatever it is, and you say that you have to imagine some of it and make some of it up. And Ian Rankin says this too when he's describing a police station. He says, I just make them up what they look like. Do you feel that there's a line that you can and cannot cross on that element? Oh, I might be able to get away with this, but not this.
Yeah, I think there is. I don't know whether you can draw it in advance. I tend to find that when I'm, for instance, describing a location, if it's a real place, I would want to make sure that it is how it purports to be. In the book, it is how it actually is on the ground, as it were. One of the advantages of Domino Island, of course, because it's a fictional island.
Yeah, of course. So you can make that up.
Yeah,
you can make
absolutely.
a lot of it. But I presume it has to have palm trees. It can't be a sort of. It can't be an arid Central Asian desert on your Caribbean.
And I think, one of the things that's been quite pleasing about Outback, the reaction to it so far, is that it's had some Australian feedback, very positive, fortunately. And one of the things I was quite keen to check with Australian readers was that that it was accurate, that it did describe things in a way that people could relate to. Everybody has said, yeah, absolutely, that's, from that point of view, it's fine. So that's good.
We've dealt with location because both the Caribbean and or more so the Australian outback, you get rugged, hostile environment type of thing hits you. Yeah. I want to talk about the creation of a hero, because you sort of inherited a hero. Yeah. The way you described it, you could have abandoned him, but you decided to keep him. What was so compelling about Bill Kemp that you wanted to develop him more?
I found him fascinating from his first entrance in Domino Island. I found it very easy to sort of step inside his head, and he resonated with me. I mean, fortunately, I don't have to explain that myself, because Jeffrey Deaver said of him, he's describing him as part James Bond, part Philip Marlowe, and all hero. So I'm not going to try and improve on that.
So part James Bond is the daring do, and Philip Marlowe is the turn of phrase, downbeat character there. Another issue we're talking there is that you have these different levels of thrillers, and that the highest stakes one, I suppose, is James Bond who saves the world from destruction. And a low stakes one is, in fact, it's not a thriller. I just saw the film Living with Bill Nighy in it, where it was about a man succeeding in getting a child's playground done. And I knew I was going to be talking to you, but how do you get low stakes, something like that, compelling in a reader's mind? I suppose the insurance investigator is sort of midway in that, isn't it?
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, and one of the things that has sort of been a recurring theme in my writing career, actually, when I've been asking readers to check early drafts, or getting feedback, or from mentors and so on, is that quite often the feedback has been raise the stakes. Find some way of making it more compelling, more something that pushes the protagonist more forcefully, something that gives them a personal vested interest, something that makes it impossible for them to walk away from whatever quest or adventure or wherever it is that they are. So that is something that I am particularly conscious of. Life and death is high stakes for any individual.
Yes, life, death, and of course whether the central character succeeds or fails, or falls in love with the right person is a sort of thing, isn't it? And
and I think any of those kind of emotional things that are universal. I mean, it's really interesting that you know, again, lots of great writers will tell you that the more specific something is, actually the more universal its appeal can be, and that's an odd paradox, but it absolutely resonates.
Yes, I think I remember somebody saying to me is that we will always care about whether one little puppy is saved, but if it's a group of little puppies, we don't really care that much.
And I think, absolutely. And transferring that into a you know, life or death situation, you know, we do care more about one person than we do about an army, for instance.
Yeah, exactly. We've got an interesting one in from Jane Collins here. I love the fact that both the Bagley stories and Outback are real adventure stories without bedroom antics. Do you have bedroom antics, Michael?
Me personally?
No, your creation, your thriller creations.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point, and I think one of the things, well, reading Bagley's correspondence, it's become apparent, and actually become friends with his sister-in-law, Joan's sister, in fact, Alicia. And she says that he was very circumspect about anything in that line because he didn't think he could do it very well. He tried it once or twice, and he always ended up kind of moving away from it, or doing the, you know, the kind of, and the curtains closed, and that, all of that happens kind of behind closed doors. That is also true in Outback. I don't know. I'm very conscious of. There's an award, isn't there, for the worst sex?
Oh, it's the bad sex award, isn't there?
That's right. That's right. And I'm kind of aware of that. I really don't want to fall foul of that. So.
But then, how does it work? Because when you're doing an action adventure, or when any of us are in an action adventure situation with a deadline and a ticking bomb or whatever it is, that you really don't have time to cut off and go and have some bedroom antics, do you?
Well, James Bond seems to do it. I don't quite know how he manages it. But yes, I think that's right. There is a danger that it interrupts the flow, and you know, I suppose for me, if I feel it's there for its own sake, that it's not. It's either not furthering the plot or it's not revealing character. Those are the two crucial things.
Yes. Have you ever written any bedroom antics at all?
I might have done once or twice.
Oh,
I think it's really difficult to do well. I think it's really hard to make it either or authentic, or you know, it can be schmaltzy, or it can be just a bit seedy, or I think it's really
I think we had about 6 months ago, we had someone on who was a crime writer extraordinaire, but he got a lot of his he got most of his money out of writing erotica under a pen name after 50 Shades of Grey came out. Maxine Jakubowski. And I thought that's interesting. Michelle Whitworth I enjoyed Michael Ridpath, I think. Ridpath's financial thrillers, for instance. Finance is an interesting topic, and like adventure thrillers very much. Much of the current crop of American features too many unbelievable supermen who spend a whole book with incredible injuries, like The Grey Man, yes, I think we know, overcome 25 armed assailants at a time, and describe pages in gruesome hand-to-hand combat and mutilation. Right, let's take that. That is let us take his unbelievable Superman. Bill Kemp, is he an unbelievable Superman?
Well, I hope not. And one of the things that I really wanted to try and do was to make sure that he remained a sort of everyman, for want of a better term. He does get into some fairly extreme scrapes, and it's probably a fine line between wanting to keep piling the pressure on, wanting to, you get out of one problem and you're faced with another one. I think those kinds of things, talking of raising the stakes.
Is he trained at getting out of scrapes, or is he the everyman that just suddenly comes up against a mugger in the street and kills him?
Well, interestingly, so far, he hasn't killed anyone. I hope that's not too much of a spoiler.
Okay.
He's certainly around when people are killed.
Yeah, right. Does he know how to use the gun?
He does know how to use guns. He's got an army background, so he's got
right.
some training, some abilities. But I wanted him to be. It's more about being resourceful. I think he's able to use what's available to him at the time. And sometimes he draws on his training to be able to do that. Sometimes it's just being, creative with whatever's to hand.
Yes. Okay. I just want to keep going down. Michelle might not have realized how many fantastic points she had in this question of hers. Yeah. But she mentions The Grey Man, which is by Mark Greaney, who's did that series. And just for, I'm not sure if you know this, Michael, everyone knows it. Mark was with an agent for about 10 years who kept rejecting his manuscripts. And then he trusted the agent. And finally, he wrote a book that the agent could sell. And of course, it became a massive bestseller. Whereas I think most authors would have said, oh, sod it, I'll get another agent. What's your view on that take that I get from The Grey Man and Mark Greaney?
Yeah, it's really, the whole question of agents is fascinating. I don't have an agent.
Oh, really? You have David Braun?
I have David Braun at HarperCollins.
Yes.
So I kind of, I'm in an incredibly fortunate situation. I absolutely recognise that it's very unusual, and I was very lucky to have established contact with David direct. Yeah. But it has meant that I haven't needed an agent.
We'll just go back on that for a moment, because when we were talking earlier, you said you've known David, for 20 or 25 years you first made contact. So you have kept up that relationship.
Yeah, and I think that really goes to the heart of it. It's absolutely about establishing and then building a relationship. I first contacted HarperCollins in '99 when I'd been talking to Joan Bagley with the view to doing a biography, because there hadn't been one. There still hasn't been one. And that was when she said, oh, yes, well, the archive is over in Boston. You're welcome to go and sort of raid it, as it were, which I still haven't done. But at that point, when I approached David, he said, because of this sort of falling out of fashion thing, even by '99, Bagley you could find his books in charity shops, but it was starting to be a little bit sort of marginalized. And David said at that point, HarperCollins didn't think there would be a market for a biography. But he himself is a big Bagley fan, of course. And we have stayed in touch ever since. And he's been very supportive. He came to, just going back to Tess, he came along to a development workshop that we had, and a showcase we had at the Arts Theatre in London. And we've stayed in touch. So when the manuscript turned up, again, I was in the fortunate position where David approached me to say, do you want to have a look at it?
I think, and just to, for those, some of you might remember, David Braun was a Goldster guest. He's a fellow alumni of yours, Michael, and he had just done the Agatha Christie series, where I think he'd got half a dozen writers to write Agatha Christie stories. And that brings me to the question of, you knew that you were writing this book, you had chosen to keep the character going. Did you write in the style, or Desmond Bagley, and how much of the style and how much of his moral compass and boundaries did you keep?
What I didn't want to do was kind of try and mimic the style. I mean,
Right.
as the quote on the front of all of his books currently says, he was the master of the genre, and trying to replicate that, I think, would have been a bit of a fool's errand. I definitely wanted to bring something of his voice to it. I was kind of aware of the little sort of Bagley sitting on my shoulder, and there are some things you talked about, for instance, some of the expressions that some of the ways that Kemp talks about things, and I absolutely felt that there were some words, phrases, descriptions that I said. I mean, there was one that came up when it was being edited, and I was talking to the editor. She raised a question mark over one particular choice of phrase, and I said, I can absolutely hear Bagley saying that. That is a Bagley phrase, and so I'd like to keep it for that reason. I think probably my own style is reasonably similar to his. We're in the same sort of area.
So you didn't feel that you were in a straitjacket, because I mean, Anthony Horowitz did Ian Fleming and James Bond. Mark Cameron has done Tom Clancy, and these are highly, talented writers, sort of writing in the style of a highly talented predecessor.
Yeah, and I don't know. I mean, Ian Rankin, of course, did it with William McIlvenney recently, and I think he said afterwards he would never do it again. He did find it very, very constraining. Horowitz, I don't think, had a particularly nice time with James Bond. He wasn't, although I think there's a new one out, isn't there, that he's written? So I don't know what their approach was to.
You don't have we are writing in the canon of these great writers. You don't have a sort of lunch every year to discuss these things.
No. I'd be very happy to be in that company.
or a WhatsApp. I want to come back to Michelle. Here is the on the second bit of thing, how the hero overcome 25 assailants at a time, describe pages of gruesome hand-to-hand combat and mutilation. Do you go for that detail, or do you tend to avoid it, or how does that work?
I think that's another area where I kind of follow Bagley's pattern. I tend to avoid it. Right. Said that, I mean, there are some areas in some of the Bagley books that are a bit kind of, gosh. But I certainly think I think the world has moved on in a way that personally I think, again, I'm in agreement with Michelle on this. Right. There's enough nasty stuff out there in the real world for me not to be adding to it in enormous detail.
I mean, it's interesting how it goes, because I just remembered you talking when Freddie Forsyth, I interviewed him, and I asked him about the bedroom antics, and he said that in Day of the Jackal, the publisher insisted that he puts in a sex scene, and I think if any of us remember that, is the Jackal ends up in a hotel bedroom with somebody he met at the bar, and he says, but I didn't like it, and it didn't really work because it was a sideshow, wasn't it? And if you're a trained assassin, you're not going to sully and risk your situation by bedding somebody for the night, or maybe they did in those days, 1960s. Anything goes. Now I want to put you on. I'm going to put you on the spot again. Show us the two books that you were, Domino Island and Outback. You've got them there. I just want to see them.
So this is Domino Island.
That's Domino Island.
That's
yes, right. And Outback.
Side by side.
That's it, side by side. Good. Now, I want you to tell us in literally 10 seconds each the opening scene of both of those. Where are they? What are the stakes? What happens?
Right. Now, that's another really interesting one. So for Domino Island, I'll read you the opening few lines. I was late into the office that morning, and Mrs. Hadley, the receptionist, told me that Jolly wanted to see me. It's urgent, she said. He's been ringing like a fire alarm. Jolly might have been his name, but jolly he certainly was not. He was a thin, dyspeptic man with a face like a prune and a nature as sour as a lemon. So instantly
you're in there. What are the
you're in
phone
there.
calls about? Who's this man? Yeah.
Yeah, and also some of his perspective on the people that he's working for and with, and that, you know, ringing like a fire alarm that's a very typical kind of Bagley turn of phrase.
Yeah. Give us the same from Outback.
Well, I
sorry.
will do. I was just going to add that what's interesting about this one is that it starts with him in the office of the insurance company in London, and you kind of think, all right, well, sounds a bit mundane, but because he's got such a clever way of suddenly throwing you into the people and the personalities, and in fact, by about page 12, you're already on a plane. Well, less than that, he's on a plane to the Caribbean very quickly. So that's quite an interesting way of opening that.
Okay, I like that.
And I'm just, before I will come to Outback, I just wanted to, on the subject of opening lines, I think one of the things that first inspired me with Bagley was Running Blind, which was a sort of mid-career novel of his, which I think has one of the best opening lines in all of thrillers, really.
Yeah.
It just goes, to be encumbered with a corpse is to be in a difficult position, especially when the corpse is without benefit of death certificate. Just
yes,
brilliant opening line.
Who is the corpse? Why no death certificate? Yeah, I mean the questions just come out of that. Yes.
So that's even within Bagley, that gives you a different style. Outback, as you pointed out kindly earlier, throws you straight in to the middle of the mine. So Outback's opening paragraph. The first thing that hit me was the coolness of the interior. After the blazing heat of the sand, which weighted down your shoulders like a wet astrakhan, it thumped you with a wall of cold. The second thing was the utter blackness. So immediately you're, hopefully...
How long did it take you to get that? How many drafts, ideas, and waking up early in the morning with a bit of line?
That opening paragraph actually came really quite quickly. I knew that I wanted to start there. And whereas Domino Island starts in the offices, the journey is sort of chronological. Outback puts you in the mine, and then you have to go through
that's right, and you don't really know who all the people are, do you? Except for the first person. And now I'm going to put you even more on the spot, because you are working on a musical from the Thomas Hardy. We're back to him, the Thomas Hardy Test of D'Urbervilles. What is the opening scene of your musical and the opening lyrics of your musical?
Well, now that's another interesting one. Musicals are a whole different ballgame altogether. And we originally started with a big opening number of a village dance, which actually is the opening scene in the novel, where lots of people get introduced in succession, and the sort of the background to the major inciting incident, to use that word, is explained fairly early on. That was the first draft. Fine, all well and good. So we went into workshops and we went through development, and somebody at some point said, do you know the story about Fiddler on the Roof? And we said, well, what story is that? And they said, in the process of developing Fiddler on the Roof, they had an opening number, and they were actually, I think they were might have been in previews, and somebody had said to them, "What, your opening number's not working." What I think the director, Jerome Robbins, who directed the original stage version, can't remember. Anyway, said to them, "Look, the opening number's not working. You need to do something, sort of overnight kind of thing." And they went away and wrestled with it, and could try to work out how they could start it again. And in the end, somebody said to them, "What is the show about?"
Right.
And the immediate response was, "It's tradition. That's what the show's about, tradition." And suddenly they said, tradition. And they wrote an opening number called Tradition, about tradition. And it works brilliantly.
Did you know what the show was about when you first started on it?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we did spend a lot of time doing was getting the story right, getting the book
Yeah.
right before we wrote actually a note of music or a word of the lyrics. There's so many musicals get chopped about and reworked because they haven't got the story right before they start. So we wanted to do that.
When you say in development, which in your entertainment business is thrown around a lot, what does it actually mean? Do you own the lyrics? Did you work on it in your garret for years before anybody was interested?
Yeah, the background to that was that Michael, the composer, and I were one of the other things that we both did at the time was corporate role play work, where you go into companies and help with their training by playing characters. And my wife Trisha also does that, and the three of us were in a sort of green room, a holding area, waiting to go and do one of these corporate role plays, and we're just chatting, and Michael said, "Oh, I've always wanted to write a musical." He was a composer and had worked as MD on various shows. He said, "I've always wanted to write a full-scale musical." And I said, "Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I've always wanted to write a musical." And it was Trisha who said, "Well, what are you doing? Don't just sit there, write it." So that was how it came about in the first instance. As far as the development goes, yeah, I mean, because it's very much off our own bat, and we haven't got a producer sat waiting for a draft to be delivered. We've been able to take some time to craft it the way that we want to. We have
right. So you have the show, the plot, the scenes, the opening number has been written. Yeah. And now you're looking for an Andrew Lloyd Webber or Cameron McIntosh to put it on, or?
Well, the whole show has been written, actually. We have a concept album recording of it, and I can plug it if you like it.
You can plug it. I mean, I think people are interested how these things work. Yes.
Yeah, well, you can absolutely. I mean, it has a website, testthemusical.com. Yes. If you go there, you can sign up, and you can then log in. You can listen to the entire thing. Okay. And so, yeah, I mean, the next stage, Michael's working on some orchestrations at the moment, but the next stage, yeah, will be to find a producer and get it put on. So which sounds easy, doesn't it? But
taking you back a few years to your childhood, you know, you're now writing, you know, best-selling thrillers just out, musical here. That's a vast sort of range of stuff to do. When you were growing up, did you say, I want to write musicals, I want to write South Pacific, Rodgers and Hammerstein, I want to be John Lennon and Paul McCartney, I want to be Alistair MacLean, Desmond Bagley? I mean, what was your prime thing going through your mind?
Yeah, I wanted to be a rock star. I think I wanted to be a film star.
Yeah.
Yeah, I sort of had all of those. You know, I think there's still time. The only one there isn't time left for is to be centre forward for England. But apart from that,
you want to be a footballer?
No, I never did, to be honest. No.
Yeah. But then when reality hits in, and you've done your education, you head out into the world, you have to earn a living, and then I just want to really get us to where we are with you now.
Yeah. So I mean, I actually my original plan was to be a lawyer. I went to university for 3 weeks and realised I didn't want to be a lawyer, and came home again. Right. And I can't remember now why, but the next thing down on the list was journalist, and I wrote, I think, about 60 letters to newspapers all over the country. And the following week, actually, my local newspaper advertised for trainee reporters. So I rang them up and said, "Look, I wrote to you last week. Could you treat it as an application?" And they did. And, you know, again, fortunately, I did my trainee journalism on my local paper, and then spent 20 years in newspapers.
What paper was your local paper?
Northampton Chronicle and Echo.
Is it still there?
It is. It was daily when I started, with a circulation of about 40,000. It's now weekly with a circulation of about 4,000. It's, you know, local newspapers are really tough business these days.
Yeah. You always wanted to move on from journalism to that. You didn't want to join the Sunday Times Insight team or become editor of Vogue.
No, I didn't actually. I mean, I did the odd sort of shift on national newspapers, and again, so quickly decided that wasn't really for me. I think you've got to have a particular kind of, I suppose, resilience, really, a drive and an ambition to make it in the national newspaper scene. And
your drive and ambition was more towards being an author and being a musical producer and lyricist.
Well, yeah, I mean, it came out on the creative side in the end.
Yeah.
It took a long time, 20 years in newspapers. But when I finally did step away from it, yeah, suddenly I found myself writing lots of different stuff. I mean, I'm going to show off here now. This is, you probably can't see it. This award here is a National Playwriting Award that I won a few years ago.
What? Tell me that play.
It's a play called Rasputin's Mother, and it kind of revisits the story of Rasputin, really trying to focus on what it is that fascinates us about those kind of historical monster figures. What is it that draws us to them, that sort of charisma?
Yes. Are they historical?
Rasputin's mother is historical. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. But the types of characters historical, I wonder, because we.
Oh. Well, yeah. I mean, I suppose taking the Arthur Miller pattern with the Crucible, where ostensibly it's about the Salem witch hunts, but of course it was about McCarthy in the 50s.
Yeah.
The parallels with what happens in Rasputin's Mother were very sort of salient.
Yeah. And in Rasputin's Mother, did you do it the same way that you're doing Tess? That you wrote it and then put it out there, and somebody then snapped it up?
Well, I wrote it and then I put it in for a competition, and it won the competition. So it was staged as a result of that. And I've got they happen in various different ways. Sometimes I write stuff because I need to write it, and sometimes I write it because somebody's asked me to write it. So I've got a play out at the moment on tour around the country, which was commissioned by a touring theatre company. I pitched the idea to them, but they actually the writing of it. I quite like deadlines as well. I think that probably comes from the newspaper background. Yeah. I like to have something. I've got to have this done by such and such a day.
Yeah. But essentially you're an individual creative character as opposed to a corporate cog in a network character.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I don't know. Writing's a really weird thing, isn't it? Some of the time you're sat on your own and you just have to, at the cold face, as it were, and sit and hammer the words out. And some of the time you're in meetings with publishers or producers or cast and crew. You're in a rehearsal room. No 2 days are the same, and I think that's one of the things I love about it.
Yeah, no 2 days are the same, and there's only yourself to blame and to whip you into shape. Nobody else can do that. Stay with us, Michael, because we're coming back to you for a couple of nuggets at the end, but this has been a great insight that we've had. I have to tell you what's coming next on Friday. No one knows more about the cinema than the great Ellen Cheshire, and we're going to be talking about her books about silent women, the women who shaped the movie industry. I've just spoken to her, and around 1900, most of the people behind the scenes there were women. Goodness, silent women she's written, and she's already written about Charlie Chaplin, James Bond, so don't miss that one if you like the cinema, or even if you don't. On June 29th, that's next Thursday, Lucinda is with Felice Hardy and her book, The Tennis Champion Who Escaped the Nazis. That's wonderful. Felice's grandmother, Liesl Herbst, was the 1930s tennis champion of Austria and later beat Tim Henman's grandmother at Wimbledon. Goodness, and many other uplifting and chilling twists to that one. Friday the 30th, Lucinda hosts Book of the Month, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, published in 1925, and a story that takes place on one summery June day in London. Tuesday, July the 4th, I'm with author, blogger, and life coach Sarah Rayner in a Goldster Purpose, Passion, and Grit Goldster conversation about dealing with mental health and how we get through life's biggest struggles. Sarah has a best-selling series, Making Friends with Anxiety, Depression, Divorce, End of Life, and so on. And on August 25th, I'm jumping a bit, but I am hosting Book of the Month. That's that freewheeling, non-recorded conversation where anything goes, a bit like with me and Michael this time, although we were recording it. Now, last time, we chose between Richard Osman's The Bullet That Missed and Franz Kafka's Metamorphoses in a haphazard Goldster focus group. Kafka won that one. In August, the choice is between the runner-up, The Bullet That Missed by Richard Osman, and Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So put in the chat to tell Joe or Ben or whoever which one you want, Stephanie, and we will pick a winner and run that in mid-July, and that'll give everybody time to read it by the end of August. Now, Michael, The Bullet That Missed and Heart of Darkness, which one would you tune into?
Oh God, that's so difficult, isn't it? I was reading this morning about Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg apparently are going to have a cage fight. Have you heard that?
No, I haven't.
It's a bit like putting Conrad and Richard Osman in.
Well, they're going to have a news page is the most successful fight, are they? Yeah, yes.
Sounds a bit crazy to me, but hey.
I'm not going to let you off. You've got to tell me which one takes your fancy out of those two.
Goodness. They're so different, aren't they? I love Richard Osman. Any kind of page-turning thriller is always going to get me. Just for location and atmosphere, which we were talking about earlier, I'll probably go with the Conrad.
Okay, so I'm going to put you down for Richard Osman. I'm going to put you down that Michael Davies wants us to do The Bullet That Missed by Richard Osman. That's it. And you can complain and take us to court or whatever, but there we go now. Now we have, very quickly, your next project, apart from Tess.
Well, the really exciting news I can not quite exclusively reveal is that HarperCollins are so pleased with Outback, they've commissioned another Bill Kemp novel. So it will be completing a trilogy. I'm in the middle of writing it right now. It's called Thin Ice, and it'll be out next year. So that's
location?
Alpine.
Thin Ice.
Alpine.
Alpine location.
And it does throw him into the Cold War. So that's another angle.
Okay, a Cold War Alpine opening line.
Can't divulge that at the moment. But,
all right, we'll let you off that one.
The paperback of Outback is out in October, and the plan is to include the opening few pages of Thin Ice in the paperback of Outback. Brilliant.
Since we've got 20 seconds left, do you open it on location or in the London Insurance Office?
On location.
On location. An Alpine Thin Ice on location. That's it. Time's winged chariot is upon us. God, I love this Goldster conversation. We went from musicals to outback deserts. Now we're in the Alpines. Thank you, Michelle and June, for your comments and questions about that. That really did lift our conversation. Until tomorrow, when we strip back on the stories of the cinema with Ellen Cheshire. Stay active, stay curious, stay conversational, stay safe, and of course, stay Goldster. Better still, persuade friends, families, and enemies to join Goldster. Thank you, Michael Davies, for a truly fantastic show. And
Thank
bye.
you very much.